coffee moment. Cheers.
Oat milk?
Black.
Oh, damn.
Yeah.
You're hardcore, babe.
I know. Well, I was having trouble with dairy.
Yeah.
Huh? Welcome to In the Act, a radio program on process and the creative life. Creativity does not just start and stop with artists. We all make aesthetic or guiding decisions. Our aim is to talk through the process and investigate how we choose to express ourselves and live creatively. We're connecting with people about their lives, and that's the subject of our show. Broadcasting from the studio at Mead Public Library in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, I'm Erica Hunsinger, and this is In the Act. And we are here with artist, mom, daughter, friend, tons of things. Beth Lipman, fantastic.
Thanks, Erica.
Thank you
so happy
much.
To be here.
I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah.
We were just talking on the way down that it takes us a long time to get together and actually have a conversation. And this
true.
Might be the Beth Erica show.
Yeah. Yeah. Throwback.
Right.
Throwback time from when we were working together.
Right. At the JMKC.
Right.
In the arts industry program. So I look to you in many ways for expansion in thinking, particularly with books.
Huh. Fascinating.
Well, I feel like you have had you're constantly learning. You're constantly researching and learning and driving yourself to find out more about not only your interests, but the world around you and how to not only incorporate new learnings into your life and into your world, but also into your artwork. And that happens in a number of different ways, whether you're reading the Times or the New Yorker or different books and interviewing or talking with people and exploring nature and other things. And I really appreciate that about you.
Thank you so much. And that is like a really fantastic way of starting the conversation, especially here at the Mead Public Library, which is one of our most favorite libraries. It was a little diplomatic, but it is. It really is something that I'm so grateful that this library is here and that it's so kind of well stocked, as it were, and so diverse. But books are such a key aspect of my life, and we do come together over that a lot. And
yeah,
I have a few special friends that not too many, but there are a few that it's like we touch base and it's about the books. Like, what are we reading? Did you see the new top 10 list that just came out as of, this week? And books are a catalyst, I think. Do they function in that way for you as well in terms of your creative practice?
Yes.
As well as life? I mean, I know
yes.
They do to a certain extent, but your work is so intuitive and expressive of that moment in time. And I wonder also how what you're reading manifests in those actions that you're taking in the studio. Because the work is generating from a place of abstraction also.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So I'm curious, punting the question back to you to a certain extent, because I think this research, if we can call it research, Hold
on one moment, please.
Yeah.
Hi, you guys. I'm sorry, but we're recording back here. Thank you. Sorry. Thanks, you guys. Sorry. Okay.
Any hoodles? Is this the way you want it to go?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
I mean, that's the interesting thing about, I think you can roll with things really easily too when there are different interruptions of life, or you're like, okay, new information. And maybe that's part of the stimulation of the book too, is that it helps to artificially use a platform to stimulate different ideas and incorporate new things, as opposed to like life happening to you. And then, they like parallel each other. They're like practice spaces, I think, in some ways too, for me. Maybe
that's
I should speak
interesting.
for myself.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, I think also, I mean, if we just talk about the act of reading at this current time.
Yes.
I feel like the act of reading has shifted substantially from the way it was prior to smartphones or just digital revolution generally, or it felt like we were not completely encompassed with technology in the 80s and 90s in the way that we are now. And so the act of reading, not only is it inspirational, but it's like it really forces you to pause. And in some cases, it becomes a struggle to carve out the time for the pause. Yeah. And that's almost the only way that information can get processed. I mean, you can listen to books, which I also do.
Yeah.
As well as podcasts, which is maybe, I'm reconsidering that even in terms of multitasking in the way that that information can flow into you. But if I were to cut that out of my life, then I would not get through the thing. Not that I'm trying to get through something, but I wouldn't get the information I'm hungry for, the curiosity that's driving me. I would be sad. Yeah. There would not be as much information coming.
Sure.
So, but I think that this, it's not just the content of what you're reading, but it's the act of reading that I think also may be generative in the creative practice. I'm curious if you think about that at all.
Well, breaking it down, that makes a lot of sense to me. And thinking about how people use podcasts and audiobooks is so that, the selling point, I feel like, is so that you can multitask.
Yeah.
And there's a different presence when you're just with your book and you're reading at your own pace, not listening to someone else's voice reading to you.
Right.
And you can review or reflect in time in those moments. I think it's a very Proustian thing to think about.
Yeah.
I would love to read Proust. This is a little aside, but how he...
I think we talked about that before.
Did we? Remembrances of things past. Is that it, right?
I definitely talked about it with Aaron, your brother.
Yeah.
I recall that conversation. Everything comes back to Proust in some ways.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
But the dissection of like moments, and I can't get through it not because I find it tedious.
Yeah.
I find it so incredibly rich.
Yeah.
And beautiful and just so present that it's almost uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That you're so incredibly present. And I think I want more of a pace, but I feel like that holds you in a certain awareness that makes it a little uncomfortable. And maybe that's what you're talking about.
It's almost I know I keep going back to digital now, and I don't know why that's popping up in this conversation so much, but it's almost like proto-digital revolution. Like the amount of input is a fire hose with Proust. And it is tedious to a certain extent. Because when we're viewing things, when we're seeing things and we're processing things neurologically, we are self-editing, which also, relates to the creative practice that we can talk about further if you'd like. But I do think we naturally tend to curate and edit to process because we can't process every single granular moment or empirical input.
Right.
And what he did is kind of, he gave it all to you, in such a way as if you could process it. And that is challenging. And it was almost like a predecessor of things to come with just the amount of information that we get deluged with every single day, I think.
Oh, sure.
And if, it depends on how you take in your information, but we certainly have access to more than we ever have now.
Absolutely.
And so the potential of being overwhelmed or super saturated and not being able to process is greater, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I also could be romanticizing the past.
As we do. I mean, I think that's such human nature. The end.
Right.
And everything's creative.
Here, we're done.
But the act of, just the act of thinking and editing, that the act of being, breathing, making those choices, how to step, where to move, how to step out, how to, those are all creative choices that you make, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's also inherent, right? Like it's not necessarily an intentional creative act, or it's not frontal, lobe kind of experience. It's something that generates from being.
Sure.
In some ways.
Sure. Through experience. And
So then it's just a matter of like harnessing it or becoming intentional if it needs to be intentional. I mean, I've been, even on the drive over here, I tried to continue. I'm really trying to practice mindfulness without meditation, which is interesting. I mean, I know because I think I'm so invested in time and the porosity of time and the elasticity of time.
What porosity is? I'm not familiar with that word.
Oh, yeah. It's like porous, like holy.
Oh,
it's,
for sure. Yeah, right.
It's like a sponge in some ways that there's, it's collapsible and expandable as well. So it's it's really elastic. But I think these creative moments or these intentional moments, just trying to rest in the moment and not drift off into problem solving in the future or thinking about the past, and just being centered in the moment and focused on what you're doing in the moment relates possibly also to the creative. I mean, I know it relates to the creative act because you have to be completely in the moment when you're painting, for instance, Erica, or when I'm sculpting or making something, making components or doing compositional work or thinking conceptually about a work, it is all related to this hyper present moment.
Yeah. I think what's helped me with that, because I tend to squirrel on everything.
Yeah.
Is yoga. And trying to quiet the mind was so hard for me. And just being still. I think it's really a challenge for most people, probably, because we don't do it very often and we haven't practiced it. And where we've had to practice it, it becomes like not of ourselves. If we have to be quiet in school or some sort of organizational thing that we have to go to. And going back to the breath is one thing that if you can just focus on your breath, and when the pieces come into your mind of thinking about something, just acknowledging it and letting it go, that it'll trust that it'll come back because it's going to come back.
In like a nanosecond.
Yeah. And just that like repetitive, almost like a wave process helps to calm me. Yeah. And I do think that getting back to what we had started with, like with reading and having that time to breathe with the book that you're reading. And even when you lose yourself in a sentence because you've thought of something else, and acknowledging it and letting it go and getting back to that sentence, it's sort of this tool, in some ways, a story time tool for mindfulness in some ways, I think.
That's right. I think that's right. I mean, I think that's why it's become more difficult to read books.
Yeah.
It is connected to mindfulness, and it's connected to focus.
Yeah.
I mean, I watched my daughter, Rachel, who reads, she's read close to 20 books this year already. And she comes home and she sits and her face is in a book. And I used to be like that.
Wow.
As a child.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to get totally lost in the narrative of the world that I happened to pick up in that day.
Yeah.
And how natural that was to do that. And then as you kind of get older, how things get in the way.
Yeah.
And the distractions kind of rise, like a flood almost.
Yeah.
And that it's difficult to get back to that.
Yeah.
But those are the moments where inspiration happens too, where you're processing and you're not really sure. The information is going in, you're experiencing whatever it is that you happen to be focusing on in literary form. And the next, several days or a month or an hour goes by and, you have something that remains or comes back to you.
Absolutely.
That is the kernel of what that you were not expecting at all necessarily from what you were reading.
Sure.
And then that gets processed in a way that gets put out in a different circumstance.
Yeah. I love that.
Do you have a sense of where, I am curious in this conversation, do you have a sense of what the next thing is that you should be reading? Do you have that itch of when you're thinking about what's next or what's in, not even what's next? I read many things at one time, which is kind of irritating to some people, but I just sometimes I'm not in the mood to continue with the book that I'm in, or it has a certain tonality to it that I can't palette at that moment.
Right.
And I shift to something else and I come back to it.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Books are definitely temperament focused yeah.
So I'm curious about that because I think that itch or that curiosity also has to do with creative practice of what is that next mark that I have to make?
Yeah.
What do I need to read next? What do I need to listen to?
I think because I'm a little intuitive and I try really hard to put structure onto my wild excess. And so I don't plan a lot, but one thing overarching, horizon line that I want to keep focusing on is reading about creativity and the flow of creativity. I can't remember what the guy's name is. It's super long. He worked at the University of Chicago. Mikkel, it's called Flow. He also wrote about creativity. There's trying to find those in-between spaces, after sensation and before cognition, really. Talking with my mom a little bit about it. It's that in-between space that I'm really interested in. And there's not a lot out there. There's the flow of creativity, which happens to a lot of people. When you get lost, for example, when you get lost if you're cooking or baking or you're riding and you automatically lose track of time, that's considered flow. I think Malcolm Gladwell, is that right? I think he wrote a little bit about that as well. And there's a French philosopher from the 30s or 20s or 40s. I'm not exactly sure when he wrote it, but it's translated into English, and it's about that in-between space, perceptions of time, of
it's a liminal space.
It's a liminal space,
essentially, right?
Yeah, and that's where my overall focus is, because I think my paintings live there. They're drawn. They're before something takes shape, really. They're before there's an image. It's pre-image, but it's after sensation. You feel something. And so that's where they kind of are defined, if there's a definition for them. And that's why I call them my inner landscapes.
That's interesting. I guess I know we've talked about your work before. And I'm not quite sure I've ever heard you describe it in that way.
Yeah.
And I find that really interesting. It reminds me of another writer, scholar, thinker that I am now very curious about reading, that my friend Atesh Atichi just told me about recently. Her name is Ellen Dissanayake. She's Seattle-based. You know her?
Yes.
So
What is art for? I believe is the...
Yeah. So, and I wasn't familiar with her work, but apparently it has to do with this like continual connection of the creative act and mark making from, the moment where hominids began to evolve. But the reason I started I think that's directly connected with what you're talking about, but I also feel that it's interesting because there are symbols and marks that have been constant from the beginning of mark making as humans, like the spiral, for instance. But those feel very symbolic or ritualistic in some ways. So it's a different, but I mean, I think it is a parallel kind of thought process in some ways to what you're talking about, even though you're not using these really universal and ancient forms.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about like your work could be found in the Lascaux caves or something like that, right? It is that. I mean, it is this connection.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. Let's take a little break.
But have you read her work?
Yeah,
Ellen?
totally excited.
Oh, have you?
Yes. So I went to art therapy school, right? And
right.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, welcome back. Welcome back. I'm so excited. I love talking to you. Okay, welcome back to In the Act. I'm Erica Hunsinger. We're with Beth Lipman, and we were talking about special books and researchers. And Ellen Dissanayake, that's how I pronounce her name. I don't know.
Mispronouncing her.
No, I don't know. But I read her when I went to art therapy school, my master's program. And I was so drawn with the idea that art came about, like one possible way that art was made or evolved was a guy, having a spear and sitting down and waiting to see, the mammal that was going to run by that he could kill or whatever. I mean, it's a little aggressive, I guess, but like sitting with his spear or her spear, this wooden piece. It was very, it was a tool that they were using, but in the process of waiting, in that reflective time, space, that you started making that spear special by mark making on it, maybe digging your fingernail into it, over and over, and it becomes like little half moons, and then you make associations and attachment to the cycle of the moon, and maybe the moon revolves around your particular tool. And whatever that is, whether if it's your making or your cooking, it's your poking stick for the fire.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think art was also used as a communication thing. And so abstraction didn't work as well for what art was necessary for. So image was important for translation and communication. Mm-hmm. There are buffalo here,
right.
The caves having the buffaloes was it buffaloes inside?
It was, it could have been deer also,
yeah,
I think.
Deer.
Or, yeah.
But the
I don't know
importance
the
and the
exact-
handprints.
Yeah,
and,
the handprint, right?
making your mark. I was here. This was important to me. This is special to me.
Mm-hmm.
This is dangerous. Those communication things are really interesting. And talking about those early symbols, Kellogg, who wrote Analyzing Children's Art, I think, early on, when children start to create humans, right? They're trying to identify what it looks like. That's one of the first things that they do, and they always start with the circle and then the radials that come off of it. The legs and hands it's usually a circle with 4 lines and another circle on top, and that's the evolution, and that's cross-cultural. That's what we see and how we interpret the world, and I think that that's why those symbols are so of us and so cross-cultural.
Right. They're recognizable no matter where
Right.
you are, who you are,
Yeah.
and what your history is.
Yeah. And you're
Yeah.
so steeped in history. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work that you do as a glass artist.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can.
Yeah, that'd
Good
be
transition.
Great. Sorry.
That was a great
Sorry.
transition. I like that. Yeah, I mean, all of the work the work generates from history.
Yes.
And I am using history as a tool to understand our current moment of, how did we get here? Where are we going?
Right.
And initially, I've been working for over 25 years. And initially, I was looking at different kind of moments in economic history, I would say, as well as civilization's history. So
right.
And I was living in New York City, and I was poor also, as one is as an artist in New York often.
Yeah.
And so I was living in this constant state of feeling like glass half empty.
Yeah.
And so I really, and it, living in that way, feeling kind of impoverished, not necessarily socially or culturally because I was as rich as the next person, but it was very much about like what I didn't have at that time in my life.
Sure.
And what I wanted. And of course, everything there is commercial. It's all late stage capitalist. Every window is a storefront for consuming.
Right.
So it was really front and center all the time. And I did kind of intuitively start to look at still life paintings from the Dutch Golden Era when I would go into museums. And I realized there was something there. And then when I really started delving deep into the history of what was then considered the Dutch Golden Era, even though that's a little bit of a controversial term now, it was so fascinating because it was the first time in history that food became a commodity. Art was acquired in large quantities because people were wealthy, so they wanted to reflect what they could afford in their homes. So the still life was very much about a representation of what, it was a fantasy of what they could have in their homes. It wasn't just welcoming when you came in the door. It was, I can afford to have all of this. And so I was really so curious about comparing and contrasting that point of time in history in that place in the world with, at the time, it was late 90s, Northeast, the United States.
Yeah.
And so starting with the premise of like almost a mercenary premise or an economic premise, that was what really was the first iteration of something that was directly, is that true? I think that's true. Directly starting to juxtapose, the time frame that we were in with history. But since then, I will say that the stilled life tradition, which is the tradition I work in, is so broad and vast in its kind of conceptual concerns that, you can look at these things as representations of wealth or status, but there's also all of these other ways of thinking about inanimate objects, the representation of inanimate objects. And it's very much about mortality. It's very much about vanitas, temporality. It's about belief systems as well, because everything that you would find in a Harlem-style painting at the time was actually fictional. Like, there was no way that you would have citrus and wine and lobster and all of these things on one table at that time.
Right.
It wasn't available.
Right.
I mean, now it's like you go to the supermarket and you can pretty much make that composition in a half an hour. But at the time, it was you're looking at a fantasy, actually.
Wow. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah. So that all of these things kind of provoked me to continue to go down the rabbit hole in different ways of, oh, well, let's really think about belief system and what our communal belief system is and how that's shifting and changing over time. And, how does that relate to religion? How does it relate to the body politic? How does it relate to aging? All of these things. Yeah. How does it relate to valuation? And so there's historical precedence for all of those places. There's just so much information there that allows me to really think anew about what I'm witnessing and observing and living now. In 2013, I started in earnest investigating deep time, geological time, prehistory, because I was so concerned with this existential threat of climate change, which began like a decade before that, but no one kind of commonly was talking about it at that time. Scientists were all over it, but no one else was really deeply into it, except for maybe Elizabeth Colbert and Al Gore.
Right.
So I started inserting kind of paleo landscapes into my work to begin to prompt the viewer to think about the context in which we're living. Like the still life, all of those inanimate cultural objects become almost human detritus at that point.
Yeah.
They're mark making of humans. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily think of a picture as like a mark, but it is an imprint on the earth from a human.
Right.
As these curtains are, or the microphone in front of me that I just bonked, or,
You're right.
So all of this, I keep thinking about how things get fossilized and what remains, after 1,000 years from now.
Right.
So it really changed I pivoted. And that was also in thanks to a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship that I did at the Natural History Museum in D.C., where I was able to really work alongside. I was hosted by an amazing paleobiologist who kind of he really unpacked, Scott Wing, he unpacked visually the direction that I needed to go. I mean, he did not do that, but the knowledge that he gave me allowed me to kind of understand that I needed to depict things in a certain way. Because, for instance, the last age of global warming in the Earth's cycle, 65,000 years ago, I was like, I'll start to incorporate flora from that time frame.
Yeah.
To depict, and so he would show me fossils of leaves, and they looked like the leaves in our backyard.
Wow!
And I was like, "Well, that looks like my maple." And he's like, "No, the veination is totally different." And I was like, "Okay, I don't make veins in my leaves.
Right?
It's not going to be helpful to me.
Right.
We'll be lucky if it looks like a maple leaf. Like, let's start there." So I realized, it brought me full circle back to really thinking about this like iconic belief system of what prehistoric landscapes look like. So I started to integrate landscapes that would maybe intuitively for the viewer spark something that felt, for some people very tropical, but essentially that is what prehistoric landscape was. It was a very hot, very, very hot, very oversized,
Right.
jungle, essentially.
Yeah.
And
pair that, our listeners may or may not know your work, and it's not like, again, you're making these things out of glass.
Yeah.
And they're not like, when you think of still life, you think of a small thing, Beth, I think. Smaller. And these are enormous, maybe enormous is for glass, I would say it's enormous. And to have all of these elements, these tables filled with glass above and below, paleo landscape, is that what you had referred it to?
That's how I think of those moments. Yeah.
And the fragility of glass, and also how long glass can live on through as well.
So long.
That it's just this bizarro element that you're dealing with, and then how it references the work that you're doing, the information that you're instilling into them, breathing into them is incredible.
Oh, thank you. A note about the permanence of glass as a material.
Yeah.
It is, in fact, the material that will be recognizable in its form longer than any other material from the age of the Anthropocene. So a glass cup 1,000 years from now will look like a glass cup.
Wow.
Never thought that was made by a human. After everything else, buildings are down.
Yeah.
Ceramic goes back.
Right.
But that material, it's crazy. I mean, plastics take a really long time to deteriorate, but they eventually do into little microscopic parts, which we both already have in our bodies.
Right.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Fantastic. Keep it coming. Yeah. Put it in our toothpaste. Yeah. Oh, great idea. Body wash.
So, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, that's not what drew me to the material originally.
Yeah.
But it is, it's something I think about. And I also am highly aware that the material that I'm choosing to use predominantly is also really resource heavy. And so I am really ambivalent about it at this point. I don't know how, I kind of rationalize and berate myself, a cycle of rationalizing and berating myself for continuing to use, if I, which is what we all, I don't know. If you're really concerned about climate change and just, the apocalypse that's coming, it's, I'll just drive to the library and get that book that I want
right
in my fossil fuel car, and get the, it's never ending. Yes. The hyper object, so fascinating.
I've not ever heard of the hyper object.
Yeah, so good.
This is so fun. I just feel like there's so much information, there's so much to talk about, and I just get so excited, and I'm thinking and whirling in my brain about all these different things.
It's great. So good. It's so good. Okay. Are we starting?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we're started.
Okay, so hyper object, it's a book by Tim Morton. He's Texas-based. And It's philosophy and ecology after the end of the world. But this is such a fascinating idea because he essentially talks about how, climate change is a hyperobject because it is so all-encompassing that it's something, going back to this idea. I mean, he describes it as sticky, that it's not something that's happening outside of you or outside of us as a community, that it is us.
Oh, yeah.
It is within us. It is through us. We are a part of it. There is no way to extract ourselves from it.
Sure.
And that leads to paralysis to a certain extent, I think.
Right.
When you can't objectify it, right?
Getting outside of yourself, objectifying to get perspective, to reintegrate and personalize.
To name,
Yeah.
to categorize.
Sure.
All of the things that happen after your process in your paintings.
Yeah.
Back at you. Yeah. Anyway, history. History in practice. I mean, it's never ending. It's very sad to think that I'm most definitely going to die before reading and learning all the things that could be truly mind-blowing about everything. It's just like the limitation.
Yeah.
The limitation of comprehending it's a
The limitation of comprehending.
Right?
Yes.
Things that you can't possibly imagine that you would have understood until you understand them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is also all related to time. Takes time to get to that point to process.
Yeah.
So I use the work, which is predominantly glass, but also I do work in photography and metal, and I've done work in ceramic and video. I do use it as a way of processing and it's like very kind of classic 20th century pursuit of using it as a way to be introspective,
Right.
and that's the primary driver in the work.
Thank you.
That processing,
Yeah.
Yeah. The importance of editing, or is it important, or what?
Let's do that. I love
Should
that.
we do that?
Sure, let's talk about that.
I'm curious about that.
Me too. Welcome back to In the Act. I'm Erica Hunsinger. This is Beth Lipman. We're with Beth Lipman.
Right. Beth Erica is here.
Beth Erica. Which we got that name because when we worked together, when we met, we were wearing the same outfit.
Which happened often and unplanned.
It happened 3 times where we were wearing almost the exact same thing, but they were all so different. One day was black with a gray sweater and black boots, and the next day we were both wearing plaid jacket
Brightest
with
color.
Green pants, Kelly green pants, and then the following day was I don't even remember what else, some blue something or other.
Right. Same hat even. I think it was the same
We
hat.
did, and somebody took a photo of us and put it on your office, Tweedledee and Tweedledum.
Right.
Because I was helping you out with arts industry. Anyway, that was really funny. But since then, we've, I think really bonded on our drive to understand and learn about the creative, not only the creative process, but about ourselves and our world, and how do they fit, and how do we utilize the information that we have to, particularly in our work, right?
I think that's true. And I also want to say that I'm so deeply grateful that we're living here at the same time. I mean, we're both from other places.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are some artists that are seriously pursuing a practice in Sheboygan, but not many.
Yeah.
Let's just say that.
Yeah.
Not many. I mean, maybe a lot for the population.
Right.
And especially for, a city that doesn't have multiple well-known universities in it, where you would normally find a hub of maybe creatives. So I think it does have a strong creative community, primarily because the John Michael Kohler Arts Center's trajectory and history in this area, and
stemming from the Kohler Company.
Stemming from Kohler,
I mean, it wouldn't be
the
international
family.
Without
100%.
Without that. And that's
100%.
a stimulation for the community completely.
That's why I came. That's why I came here. But I think now I've lived here now for 15 years or plus, give or take. And I think I'm so grateful every time we come together that we can sink into a very explorative and deep conversation about our life and our practice pretty much right away. Like it's a seamless transition for us. Like, okay, let's get down to it. Like we've got time is limited. Let's do this,
Right.
And I think it's just I am so grateful for our friendship, Erica. And I also am grateful to witness your creative practice and the way that you have and will continue to negotiate your life and blend your life and your creative practice, which I think is really a source of inspiration. I mean, every artist does it differently.
Yeah.
There may be some similarities. There may be some crossover in terms of ways of strategizing of how to continue to make time for a practice. But I think it's been especially wonderful witnessing you in that journey and how your practice has remained constant and evolving while, you figure out where you're going to live and where you're going to work. And as we all do, these are life questions.
Right.
And how you thrive in that. So thank you. Yeah.
Jeez,
thanks for being in my life. It's a big deal. And Mead is so awesome because you're here and so many amazing other people are here.
Everybody's so amazing here. They're all so smart and they're on top of everything and they've read everything and it's so fun. It's like
so great.
Yeah, it's great.
Kind of want to be a librarian in my next iteration. If the art thing doesn't work out, I'll be a librarian. So yeah,
when that weaving of, we were talking about weaving of time in the break of like editing and stuff too. And I think that, when you're talking about, which I deeply appreciate all the words that you said to me, but trying to weave the life that is going to be the best for you for now, is also about editing. And also about like that structure.
It's all editing, isn't it?
It's a lot of editing.
So much editing. So much editing.
So yeah.
There's editing that happens in the studio, and then there's the editing that happens in your life so that you can get to the studio.
Right.
As well.
Yeah.
And I think the longer that you practice, the more apparent it is that you cannot do it all, that you have to, to hell with FOMO. Like you cannot.
What's FOMO?
Fear of missing out.
Oh. I don't have that. I feel like I'm good.
That's right.
I got it.
That's right.
It's all right.
That's right. You go do that over there and I'll just be over here.
Yeah, sorry, I
enjoy
it. Yeah,
yeah. But I think at different points in one's life, you may want to be more expansive and out in the world and making sure that you're. But
the ebb and flow of it.
To me, it's like I just need to get in the studio every single moment that I possibly can if I'm not spending it with my family, essentially. So
why?
I have a sense of urgency of, I'm pretty highly functional at this point in my life. Perhaps some people might want to ping me on that, but I feel fairly highly functional. And
I would say
I don't know how long I'll have to do what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I do find, I really am super clued into the finitude of life. So I got to get things done. I have to get things done. And so I just, try to compartmentalize. And I also have been trying to practice saying no more, which is difficult because I also really enjoy being in community, and I also believe in giving back to community.
Yeah.
If I'm able to.
Sure.
Because I had a lot of help and support as an artist and a maker in my life. I don't want to say get to where I am because that's weird. But I didn't have all the opportunities and experiences that I had because I operated in a vacuum autonomously.
Yes, and no one does.
Exactly.
It's so important to recognize you're the driver, right? But you have these people and things that you can draw from and give to. That, again, that ebb and flow, right, of that. And so much of glasswork too has to be a community, much like ceramics is. Like you can't do all the stuff that you need to do to be a glass artist on your own. Like you have to, how do you watch the kiln? And if you're slumping glass, or how do you manage the other fire kiln that has the glowing
the glory
soup
hole
in it?
You're looking at the furnace and glory hole.
Thanks. I don't know the
terminology. Is the terminology you're grasping at there, right?
Yeah,
right. But I think that is like a metaphor for life, that we're all connected.
Absolutely.
Which is in the face. It throws in the face to the contemporary artist, the myth of the contemporary artist, where we're all autonomously working.
Right. That all of our stuff is completely unique.
And the individual.
Right.
Right. That it's
we draw from
it's
so
just
much.
not, I mean, even like, okay, so I'm reading 9th Street Women, which is maybe I'm totally behind in reading this, but I have eventually gotten to it. And it's just so interesting because in art history, of course, when I was in school, I learned about Jackson Pollock and de Kooning. And I've also read about de Kooning, who I find to be super interesting.
Yes.
But all of the people the women surrounding these iconic abstract expressionists who redefined art as we know it, those women were, they were practicing, they were supporting, they were fully creating a web in which certain individuals could really become recognized.
Yeah.
It was all about that. They couldn't have done it.
No.
Without
the support of
the women around them.
Absolutely.
Who were also significant artists who have been overlooked for decades.
Right. Well, you probably had the art history book that didn't have any women in it.
That's right.
Like maybe a token. Oh, there's a woman in there.
Mary Cassatt.
Right. There you go.
Mary Cassatt.
Cassatt.
See, there was a woman.
Gunther. Oh, what was she? The Blue Rider. What was the one? She's another. I can't remember what her name is. There you go. Yeah. There's.
Right.
So. Yeah, what a good point. Oh my gosh, what a giant hole I just fell into of reverberation of getting back to that of there are so many women artists out there that have been making, but there are also so many women that have been supporting or the male counterpart that then have succeeded because they've been taking care of everything else.
Right.
To have them succeed.
Right.
And that's in this time, in these last few years, that's become understandable and recognizable. And it's not about threat. it's just about being seen and acknowledged and having the same opportunities and allowances and fairness that has been given to pretty much white men. And the landscape of that changing and
it's
growing.
Exciting,
and it's exciting, and to have advocates everywhere for that. And I think that so much of it is about collaboration, getting back to that like idea of we're better together, getting back to that sort of working together, mindfulness, just be mindful of those
and seeing what has been invisible for so long.
Absolutely.
This whole isn't it interesting living right now with this massive revisionist history taking place?
Yeah.
I mean, it's also maybe cyclical, like, oh my God, we're doing this again.
Oh, yeah.
We did this in the 60s. We did this in the 70s.
Every 100 years, too, right? It's like the generations lose the information. We need a better job of teaching about history.
And we need to not be afraid of history, like, that like CRT that is just become such a lightning rod for fear, basically, and distrust, and it's just like, okay, let's just think about this as a different way of empathizing and imagining what it might be like to not be you.
Right. But, with the advent of like all of that positive psychology that took place in like the 90s and 2000s of like, oh, let's not think about that. Don't think about that. Think about the positive. Move towards the positive. You're denying so much of yourself as a human and acknowledging all of those different pieces that need to be acknowledged and be seen to instill change, really, to create change and to create a different you, systemically as a society, as well as personally and relationally. And I think that is a great deal to do with like not wanting to like, oh, we don't need to learn about that history, that kind of thing. And that is creative, though. I think that's the wealth of creativity is in that wholeness of self.
Well, you have to integrate, right? We have to incorporate all aspects. Can we ping that for creativity? I want to hear more about.
What does that mean if you want to ping it?
Like, I want to refocus on, I'm going to highlight, I'm highlighting your reference to creativity in relation to becoming whole. I'm curious if you can talk more about that. Or not.
Yeah, it's time.
That's fine. Maybe you didn't want to answer that anyway.
Right. There's always so much to talk about.
Saved by the bell.
I mean, we could talk about creativity for a really long time. We could talk about the process of being human and the acts in which we choose and what we view and what we read and how we integrate it, and for a really long time together, I think. Yeah. And that's exciting. And I am very thankful for you.
Oh, so thankful for you.
And I'm so glad that you're here. And sharing space at this time on this earth in this area.
Pretty magnificent.
It is, yeah. Where can people find you? What's your contact information?
Yeah. I have a website that is just my name, BETHLIP as in Paul, MAN, bethlipman.com. And it's pretty current most of the time, but you could sign up for mailing list blasts from that point.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing all of your self, part of yourself with us.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I always really, really enjoy talking to you, Erica Hunsinger.
Samesies.
You are a treasure.
Oh, stop it. Feel the same way.
Heart. Okay.
In the Act is produced in the studios at Mead Public Library in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. More information on the web at meadpl.org.